First Part, Chapter 3 of Essay on the Creative Imagination. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay on the Creative Imagination by Théodule-Ribot. First Part, Analysis of the Imagination. Chapter 3, The Unconscious Factor. 1. By this term I designate principally, not exclusively, what ordinary speech calls inspiration. In spite of its mysterious and semi-mythological appearance, the term indicates a positive fact, one that is ill understood in a deep sense, like all that is near the roots of creation. This concept has its history, and if it is permissible to apply a very general formula to a particular case, we may say that it has developed according to the law of the three states assumed by the positivists. In the beginning, inspiration is literally ascribed to the gods, among the Greeks to Apollo and the Muses, and in like manner under various polytheistic religions. Later, the gods become supernatural spirits, angels, saints, etc. In one way or another, it is always regarded as external and superior to man. In the beginnings of all inventions, agriculture, navigation, medicine, commerce, legislation, fine arts, there is a belief in revelation. The human mind considers itself incapable of having discovered all that. Creation has arisen, we do not know how, in a total ignorance of the processes. Later on, these higher beings become empty formulas, mere survivals. There remain only the poets to invoke their aid, through the force of tradition, without believing in them. But side by side with these formal survivals, there remains a mysterious ground which is translated by vague expressions and metaphors, such as enthusiasm, poetic frenzy, possession by a spirit, being overcome, having the devil inside one, the spirit whispers as it lists, etc. Here we have come out of the supernatural without, however, attempting a positive, that is, a scientific, explanation. Lastly, in the third stage, we try to sound this unknown. Psychology sees in it a special manifestation of the mind, a particular semi-conscious, semi-unconscious state, which we must now study. At first sight, and considered in its negative aspect, inspiration presents a very definite character. It does not depend on the individual will. As in the case of sleep or digestion, we may try to call it forth, encourage it, maintain it, but not always with success. Inventors, great and small, never cease to complain over the periods of unproductiveness which they undergo in spite of themselves. The wiser among them watch for the moment, the others attempt to fight against their evil fate and to create despite nature. Considered in its positive aspect, inspiration has two essential marks, suddenness and impersonality. A. It makes a sudden eruption into consciousness, but one presupposing a latent, frequently long labor. It has its analogues among other well-known psychic states, for example, a passion that is forgotten, which after a long period of incubation reveals itself through an act, or better, a sudden resolve after endless deliberation which did not seem able to come to a head. Again, there may be absence of effort and of appearance of preparation. Beethoven would strike haphazard the keys of a piano, or would listen to the songs of birds. With Chopin, says George Sand, creation was spontaneous, miraculous, he wrought without foreseeing. It would come complete, sudden, sublime. One might pile up like facts in abundance. Sometimes, indeed, inspiration bursts forth in deep sleep and awakens the sleeper, and lest we may suppose this suddenness to be especially characteristic of artists, we see it in all forms of invention. You feel a little electric shock striking you in the head, seizing your heart at the same time. That is the moment of genius. Buffon. In the course of my life I have had some happy thoughts, says Du Bois-Reymond, and I have often noted that they would come to me involuntarily, and when I was not thinking of the subject. Claude Bernard has voiced the same thought more than once. B. Impersonality is a deeper character than the preceding. It reveals a power superior to the conscious individual, strange to him, although acting through him, a state which many inventors have expressed in the words, "I counted for nothing in that." The best means of recognizing it would be to write down some observations taken from the inspired individuals themselves. We do not lack them, and some have the virtue of good observation. But that would lead us too far afield. Let us only remark that this unconscious impulse acts variously according to the individual. Some submit to it painfully, striving against it just like the ancient Pythoness at the time of giving her oracle. Others, especially in religious inspiration, submit themselves entirely, with pleasure, or else sustain it passively. Still others of a more analytic turn have noted the concentration of all their faculties and capacities on a single point. But whatever characteristics it takes on, remaining impersonal at bottom and unable to appear in a fully conscious individual, we must admit, unless we wish to give it a supernatural origin, that inspiration is derived from the unconscious activity of the mind. In order to make sure of its state, it would then be necessary to make sure first of the nature of the unconscious, which is one of the enigmas of psychology. I put aside all the discussions on the subject as tiresome and useless for our present aim. Indeed, they reduce themselves to these two principal propositions. For some, the unconscious is a purely physiological activity, a cerebration. For others, it is a gradual diminution of consciousness, which exists without being bound to me, that is, to the principal consciousness. But these are full of difficulties and present almost insurmountable objections. Let us take the unconscious as a fact, and let us limit ourselves to clearing it up, relating inspiration to mental states that have been judged worthy of explaining it. 1. Hypermnesia, or exaltation of memory, in spite of what has been said about it, teaches us nothing in regard to the nature of inspiration, or of invention in general. It is produced in hypnotism, mania, the excited period of circular insanity, at the beginning of general paralysis, and especially under the form known as the gift of tongues in religious epidemics. We find, it is true, some observations, among others one by Regis of an illiterate newspaper vendor composing pieces of poetry of his own, indicating that a heightened memory sometimes accompanies a certain tendency toward invention. But hypermnesia, pure and simple, consists of an extraordinary flood of memories, totally lacking that essential mark of creation, new combinations. It even appears that in the two instances there is rather an antagonism, since heightened memory comes near to the ideal law of total redintegration, which is, as we know, a hindrance to invention. They are alike only with respect to the great mass of separable materials, but where the principle of unity is wanting, there can be no creation. 2. Inspiration has often been likened to the state of excitement preceding intoxication. It is a well-known fact that many inventors have sought it in wine, alcoholic liquors, toxic substances like hashish, opium, ether, etc. It is unnecessary to mention names. The abundance of ideas, the rapidity of their flow, the eccentric spurts and caprices, novel ideas, strengthening of the vital and emotional tone, that brief state of bounding fancy of which novelists have given such good descriptions, make evident to the least observing that under the influence of intoxication the imagination works to a much greater extent than ordinarily. Yet how pale that is compared to the action of the intellectual poisons above mentioned, especially hashish. The artificial paradise of De Quincey, Moreau de Tours, Théophile Gautier, Baudelaire, and others have made known to all an enormous expansion of the imagination launched into a giddy course without limits of time and space. Strictly, these are facts representing only a stimulated, artificial, temporary inspiration. They do not take us into its true nature. At the most, they may teach us concerning some of their physiological conditions. It is not even an inspiration in the strict sense, but rather a beginning, an embryo, an outline, analogous to the creations produced in dreams, which are found very incoherent when we awake. One of the essential conditions of creation, a principal element, the directing principle that organizes and unifies, is lacking. Under the influence of alcoholic drinks and of poisonous intoxicants, attention and will always fall into exhaustion. 3. With greater reason it has been sought to explain inspiration by comparison with certain forms of somnambulism, and it has been said that it is only the lowest degree of the latter state, somnambulism in a waking state. In inspiration it is as though a strange personality were speaking to the author. In somnambulism it is the stranger himself who talks or holds the pen, who speaks or writes, in a word, does the work. It would thus be the modified form of a state that is the culmination of subconscious activity and a state of double personality. As this last explanatory expression is wonderfully abused and is called upon to serve in all conditions, preciseness is indispensable. The inspired individual is like an awakened dreamer. He lives in his dream. Of this we might cite seemingly authentic examples, Shelley, Alfieri, etc. Psychologically, this means that there is in him a double inversion of the normal state. To begin with, consciousness monopolized by the number and intensity of its images is closed to the influences of the outside world, or else receives them only to make them enter the web of its dream. The internal life annihilates the external, which is just the opposite of ordinary life. Further, the unconscious or subconscious activity passes to the first plane, plays the first part, while preserving its impersonal character. This much allowed, if we would go further, we are thrown into increasing difficulties. The existence of an unconscious working is beyond doubt. Facts in profusion could be given in support of this obscure elaboration, which enters consciousness only when all is done. But what is the nature of this work? Is it purely physiological? Is it psychological? We come to two opposing theses. Theoretically, we may say that everything goes on in the realm of the unconscious, just as in consciousness, only without a message to me, that in clear consciousness the work may be followed up step by step, while in unconsciousness it proceeds likewise, but unknown to us. It is evident that all this is purely hypothetical. Inspiration resembles a cipher dispatch, which the unconscious activity transmits to the conscious process, which translates it. Must we admit that in the deep levels of the unconscious there are formed only fragmentary combinations, and that they reach complete systematization only in clear consciousness, or rather, is the creative labor identical in both cases? It is difficult to decide. It seems to be accepted that genius, or at least richness in invention, depends on the subliminal imagination, not on the other, which is superficial in nature and soon exhausted. The one is spontaneous, true; the other artificial, feigned. Inspiration signifies unconscious imagination, and is only a special case of it. Conscious imagination is a kind of perfected state. To sum up, inspiration is the result of an underhand process existing in men in some to a very great degree. The nature of this work being unknown, we can conclude nothing as to the ultimate nature of inspiration. On the other hand, we may in a positive manner fix the value of the phenomenon in invention, all the more as we are inclined to overvalue it. We should, indeed, note that inspiration is not a cause but an effect, more exactly, a moment, a crisis, a critical stage. It is an index. It marks either the end of an unconscious elaboration, which may have been very short or very long, or else the beginning of a conscious elaboration, which will be very short or very long. This is seen especially in cases of creation suggested by chance. On the one hand, it never has an absolute beginning. On the other hand, it never delivers a finished work. The history of invention sufficiently proves this. Furthermore, one may pass beyond it. Many creations long in preparation seem without a crisis, strictly so called, such as Newton's law of attraction, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and the Mona Lisa. Finally, many have felt themselves really inspired without producing anything of value. 2. What has been said up to this point does not exhaust the study of the unconscious factor as a source of new combinations. Its role can be studied under a simpler and more limited form. For this purpose, we need to return for the last time to association of ideas. The final reason for association, outside of contiguity, in part at least, must be sought in the temperament, character, individuality of the subject, often even in the moment, that is, in a passing influence, hardly perceptible because it is unconscious or subconscious. These momentary dispositions in latent form can excite novel relations in two ways: through mediate association and through a special mode of grouping which has recently received the name constellation. 1. Mediate association has been well known since the time of Hamilton, who was the first to determine its nature and to give a personal example that has become classic. Loch Lomond recalled to him the Prussian system of education because, When visiting the lake, he had met a Prussian officer who conversed with him on the subject. His general formula is this: A recalls C, although there is between them neither contiguity nor resemblance, but because a middle term B, which does not enter consciousness, serves as a transition between A and C. This mode of association seemed universally accepted, when latterly it has been attacked by Münsterberg and others. People have had recourse to experimentation, which has given results only in slight agreement. For my own part, I count myself among those contemporaries who admit mediate association, and they are the greater number. Scripture, who has made a special study of the subject, and who has been able to note all the intermediate conditions between almost clear consciousness and the unconscious, considers the existence of mediate association as proven. In order to pronounce as an illusion a fact that is met with so often in daily experience, and one that has been studied by so many excellent observers, there is required more than experimental investigations, the conditions of which are often artificial and unnatural, some of which, moreover, conclude for the affirmative. This form of association is produced, like the others, now by contiguity, now by resemblance. The example given by Hamilton belongs to the first type. In the experiments by Scripture are found some of the second type. For example, a red light recalled, through the vague memory of a flash of strontium light, a scene of an opera. It is clear that by its very nature, mediate association can give rise to novel combinations. Contiguity itself, which is usually only repetition, becomes the source of unforeseen relations, thanks to the elimination of the middle term. Nothing, moreover, proves that there may not sometimes be several latent intermediate terms. It is possible that A should call up D through the medium of B and C, which now remain below the threshold of consciousness. It seems even impossible not to admit this in the hypothesis of the subconscious, where we see only the two end links of the chain without being able to allow a break of continuity between them. 2. In his determination of the regulating causes of association of ideas, Ziehen designates one of these under the name of constellation, which has been adopted by some writers. This may be enunciated thus: the recall of an image, or of a group of images, is in some cases the result of a sum of predominant tendencies. An idea may become the starting point of a host of associations. The word Rome can call up 100. Why is one called up rather than another, and at such a moment rather than at another? There are some associations based on contiguity and on resemblance which one may foresee, but how about the rest? Here is an idea A. It is the center of a network. It can radiate in all directions, B, C, D, E, F, etc. Why does it call up now B, later F? It is because every image is comparable to a force, which may pass from the latent to the active condition, and in this process may be reinforced or checked by other images. There are simultaneous and inhibitory tendencies. B is in a state of tension and C is not, or it may be that D exerts an arresting influence on C. Consequently, C cannot prevail. But an hour later, conditions have changed, and victory rests with C. This phenomenon rests on a physiological basis, the existence of several currents diffusing themselves through the brain, and the possibility of receiving simultaneous excitations. A few examples will make plainer this phenomenon of reinforcement, in consequence of which an association prevails. Wahl reports that the Gothic Hôtel de Ville, near his house, had never suggested to him the idea of the Doge's palace at Venice, in spite of certain architectural likenesses, until a certain day when this idea broke upon him with much clearness. He then recalled that 2 hours before he had observed a lady wearing a beautiful brooch in the form of a gondola. Sully rightly remarks that it is much easier to recall the words of a foreign language when we return from the country where it is spoken than when we have lived a long time in our own, because the tendency toward recollection is reinforced by the recent experience of the words heard, spoken, read, and a whole array of latent dispositions that work in the same direction. In my opinion, we would find the finest examples of constellation, regarded as a creative element, in studying the formation and development of myths. Everywhere and always, man has had for material scarcely anything save natural phenomena: the sky, land, water, stars, storms, wind, seasons, life, death, etc. On each of these themes he builds thousands of explanatory stories, which vary from the grandly imposing to the laughably childish. Every myth is the work of a human group which has worked according to the tendencies of its special genius, under the influence of various stages of intellectual culture. No process is richer in resources, of freer turn, or more apt to give what every inventor promises, the novel and unexpected. To sum up, the initial element, external or internal, excites associations that one cannot always foresee, because of the numerous orientations possible, an analogous case to that which occurs in the realm of the will when there are present reasons for and against, acting and not acting, one direction or another, now or later, when the final resolution cannot be predicted and often depends on imperceptible causes. In conclusion, I anticipate a possible question. Does the unconscious factor differ in nature from the two others, intellectual and emotional? The answer depends on the hypothesis that one holds as to the nature of the unconscious itself. According to one view, it would be especially physiological, consequently different. According to another, the difference can exist only in the processes. Unconscious elaboration is reducible to intellectual or emotional processes, the preparatory work of which is slighted, and which enters consciousness ready-made. Consequently, the unconscious factor would be a special form of the other two, rather than a distinct element in invention. End of first part, Chapter 3.